I'm here in the CNBC Washington, D.C. Bureau with Fed Governor Chris Waller. Governor Waller, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure to be on.
So we just reported you're one of the finalists for Fed Chair. How do you feel about that?
I don't know if I am a finalist or not. I thought the interview went well. I didn't get hit by a pitch, I don't think. So we'll see where it goes from here.
Well, hit by a pitch, you get a base, right? If that were the case. I understand they were rigorous interviews, like 2-hour interviews. Was it?
Yeah, well, they were great. I mean, it was actually a great interview. I mean, it was a lot of discussion about various aspects of the Fed, talked about various speeches I've given, my points of view. They kind of wanted to follow up on details of it. And I just thought it was great. I mean, it was really, there was nothing political about it. There was nothing, it was all serious economic discussions. So that's why I thought it was a great interview.
Well, maybe we'll come back to that later. But the original point of this interview, in my mind, was policy in the dark. Right? How do you make policy in the absence of the economic data? We learned this morning you are going to get the CPI. Tell us in general about your concern or lack of concern about trying to figure out what the right policy is without the economic data.
Well, remember, we've had shutdowns before, and this popped up. I can't remember what year it was, but it did pop up once before where we weren't going to get data or it was delayed. And that became, what are we going to do? And that was when we looked at a lot of private sector data that still comes out. And there's a lot of it. Now, the problem is it's not necessarily representative or as broad as sort of the government official data. But if you get enough pieces of information, you can kind of pretty much get a picture of what's happening. So, for example, there's lots of things popping about from the labor market that we're hearing. Like Carlisle had something the other day, ADP. We get all these things. They're not really representative and they're very specific, but they're all telling you the same story. The labor market is weak, right? And that's the punchline for policy. That's what we need to know. So it isn't one specific number, but collectively these 1,000 paper cut kind of data things tell us the labor market's not doing great.
How weak is the labor market as your judgment from that data?
Well, like I said, I think the data that we saw with ADP is consistent with what we were starting to see with the BLS data. The job growth has probably been negative the last few months.
Wow.
Doesn't look like it's doing much better. Anecdotally, that's pretty much, I don't hear anybody with big hiring plans. All I ever hear is we're not backfilling, we're not firing, we're holding off any job things. That's the anecdotal evidence that you want to talk business. So again, this is all consistent with whatever pieces of private sector data. And I think that's what you would get from the BLS data. If you came out and said it was 150,000 jobs a month, I'd be shocked.
Okay.
It wouldn't match anything else I'm hearing.
But you also look at more high-frequency ADP data. What is that telling you?
Yeah, it's the same thing. The ADP isn't necessarily that strongly correlated in many ways. That's why people have dismissed it. But, hey, it's got some correlation. It gives you some signal of what's going on. So use what you have when you have it.
How important is it that you're going to get the BLS CPI data?
I think that helps a lot. You know, that's one of the biggest concerns my colleagues in particular have is about inflation. The BLS, the labor data is done. Let it out. Come on, give it to us. You don't have to hold it back. And then if you have the jobs, the CPI, that's two of the biggest data points, and we can see how that matches up with the rest of the private sector stuff we're getting.
Looking at what has been said recently, the committee's pretty divided on the need for additional rate cuts. And there's a lot more concern with, among some of your colleagues, with the inflation data. It seems like you are less concerned, and why is that?
Well, this is a position I've taken a year or so ago. Tariffs, any tariff effects, which everybody's kind of focused on, are one-off effects. It doesn't mean they all happen in 1 month. They can happen in small steps, but they're one-time increases in the price level. This doesn't cause persistent inflation, and this has long been the standing of central banks for decades, that you look through these types of things. Canada had a VAT tax back in the 90s, and they said, we're not going to pay attention to what it does for prices. And they were the ones that coined the phrase, you look through these things. So I've taken that view with tariffs, and then we know it's going to have some potentially temporary effect. I don't think it's particularly that big. It could be, but that's what we'll see. But if the idea is that this will be, inflation will come up and then come back down, we don't set policy based. You shouldn't be setting policy based on that. So for me, I'm looking at the labor market as my biggest concern. So I made this point back in June to you that the labor market was not as good as it looked.
Right.
And the August 1st jobs report came out and pretty much confirmed that view. So the labor market's just not that strong, and that's everything we're hearing. And so I have shifted my focus more to the labor market when I think about policy.
I don't know that people understand the importance of the labor market in your mind, I think, to the inflation story. which is that you see, if it was a tight labor market and a strongly growing labor market, you would have more concern with the tariff inflation, if I'm not mistaken, because then the labor market would be a source of the inflation.
Well, it's just the labor market would be fine. Our dual mandate says maximum employment, price stability. If you have negative job growth, that's not maximum employment when you're shrinking your hiring. If the labor market, if there truly were shortages, then you would see wages going up, vacancies would be going up, lots of things would be signaling a tight labor market. None of that exists in public data, government data, or in the private sector data. So the labor market is not tight in any way, shape, or form. And if that's the case, you're not going to get the typical thing that people are afraid of with like tariff-type inflation, is that there's a second-round knock-on effect. Prices go up, workers demand higher wages, those wages get passed through, and you get these kind of wild price spiral, wage price spirals. That's not happening. We're not seeing any evidence of that whatsoever. So forget about any second-round effects from the tariffs.
One of your colleagues, Stephen Myron, new colleague, said that he does not see almost any inflation, even in imported goods. Is that your read of the data?
No, we see it in various measures, and all you have to do is go talk to businesses, and they'll tell you. What I'm typically getting when I talk to CEOs of companies is higher income consumers, they pass tariffs through to those goods because the people are very price insensitive. Lower half of the income distribution, they're not passing the stuff through at all because their customers will walk out the door. So again, you're seeing it in a two-tier way. They're not being passed through at the lower level. You are seeing some pass through. You can simply look at the change in prices of goods over the last 6 months and plot it against the tariff.
Right.
And there's a very clear correlation between the size of the tariff and the change in the price of those goods over the last 6 months.
Chris,
it's about a 40% pass through.
Where does policy need to go from here, in your opinion?
Well, I think we need to, I'm still in the belief we need to cut rates. But we need to kind of be cautious about it, because here's one of the things you're looking at. You're seeing this very weak labor market, but GDP growth seems pretty good. And GDP now is forecasting like close to 4%. You can't have negative job growth and 4% GDP growth. Something's got to give. Either the labor market rebounds to match the GDP growth, or that GDP growth is going to pull back. So whichever way that goes, it's got to affect what you do with policy. If the labor market rebounds and growth is good, there's less need for rate cuts. If the GDP comes down, the labor market stays weak, you need more. So that's where the caution comes in about, like, we want to move in a certain direction. I want to move towards cutting rates. But you're not going to do it aggressively and fast in case you make a big mistake on which way that thing's going.
But the market's priced in for sequential cuts through the end of the year.
That's fine. That's what the SEP kind of signals.
And so, but that's cautious enough for you, going by a quarter point?
Yeah, because you can always adjust as you go, as the data comes in. I mean, if you went 75 tomorrow, then you have a bit of a problem if you got the wrong bet.
I see.
So you can just do 25, keep going, see how it goes, see how it goes.
Last question, Chris. There's been some interesting developments in the private credit market. This is a new thing that's out there, a new shadow lending industry. How much concern do you have that it's a potential source of systemic risk?
The thing with private credit, as I understand it, I'm not an expert in these things, but with private credit, there's a lot of equity position, right? These are not highly leveraged lending. Right, there's a lot of equity. So if you are doing any kind of lending, like if the major banks are involved, they take a senior tranche position. There's usually about 50% or more equity in that. There's a lot of equity that has to get eaten into before anybody gets defaulted on their thing. So I don't view it as that big of a risk because there's so much equity. Now, people are going to lose money, but that's capitalism, man. It's not my job to protect your wealth. You want to take risk, if it pays off, good for you, and if it doesn't pay off, you lose your money, so be it. That's the way it works.